The farm sat where the road gave up trying. A thin strip of asphalt narrowed into gravel, then into dust, then into nothing at all. Beyond it stretched acres of Texas land that looked empty until you stared long enough to realize it was full of small movements. Grass bending under wind, insects lifting and disappearing, fence wire humming softly like it remembered being touched. From a distance, the place seemed peaceful. From closer up, it felt paused, as if something had happened there that never finished happening. People often imagine disappearances as moments, doors slamming, engine starting, footsteps fading. But this one began with quiet. Not the dramatic kind, not the kind that announces itself. It was the ordinary quiet of rural life, the kind no one questions, the kind that allows days to pass without checking, without worrying, without knocking on doors that stay closed longer than usual. The farmhouse didn't look abandoned at first. Not really. The windows were intact. The porch sagged the way porches always do when they've carried years of boots and rocking chairs. There was no sign of struggle, no message left behind, no final gesture asking to be remembered. It was just still, and in that stillness, something was missing. When people vanished from this farm, there was no immediate word for it. No one said disappearance. No one said danger. They said things like, probably gone for a while, or maybe visiting family, or they always kept themselves anyway. In places like this, absence doesn't always register as loss. Sometimes it registers as space. The land had seen generations come and go. It had absorbed droughts, arguments, laughter, and silence long before this family ever stepped onto it. It didn't react when they stopped showing up. It didn't change color. It didn't crack open to reveal what it knew. It just kept holding everything the way land does, patient, unbothered, unaccusing. What makes this story unsettling isn't how loudly it begins, but how quietly it refuses to end. For weeks after they were last seen, nothing about the farm looked wrong enough to be alarming. The mailbox filled, then overflowed. Weeds crept close to the house, but weeds always creep. The animals were gone, but animals are sold, moved, traded. A light stayed off at night, where it once glowed faintly. But lights burn out. People forget to replace them. In rural Texas, no one rushes to conclusions. Distance stretches time. Concern moves slowly when houses are far apart and lives are lived inward. The idea that something terrible could have happened didn't arrive all at once. It arrived in fragments, half-thoughts that were easy to dismiss. And so the silence grew legs. It learned how to walk unnoticed. There is a particular kind of quiet that settles over places where answers are missing. It's heavier than ordinary silence. It presses against the chest, even if you can't explain why. Locals who drove past the property years later would say they felt it without knowing the story, a sensation that lingered just long enough to be uncomfortable, then vanished the moment they looked away, as if the land itself didn't want to be stared at too closely. No one remembers the exact day the worry should have started. That's part of the problem. There was no clear line between normal absence and something being wrong. The farm simply slipped out of conversation, and once it did, it became easier not to bring it back. Time passed the way it always does. Quietly at first, then all at once. Seasons rotated. Ownership papers changed hands. New fences went up. Old ones fell down. The farmhouse aged without witnesses. And the people who had once lived there became a question no one felt equipped to ask. Disappearance, in cases like this, isn't an act. It's a process. It happens when no one is looking directly at you, when routines dissolve, and no one notices which moment was the last true one, when the world assumes you'll come back, because it's easier than imagining you won't. The silence around the farm wasn't empty. It was layered, built from assumptions, politeness, and the unspoken agreement that some things are better left alone. It protected whoever knew more than they said. It punished those who trusted that someone else was paying attention. And yet, silence is never permanent. It just waits. Years later, when people tried to reconstruct the beginning of all, they kept returning to this moment. Not an event, not a crime, but a pause. A stretch of days where nothing happened loudly enough to be remembered, where the absence of people didn't yet feel like the presence of something wrong. That's the most unsettling part. The realization that the mystery didn't start with a discovery. It started with no discovery at all. The farm still stands under the same sky, exposed to the same sun that bleaches everything evenly. Birds still pass overhead. The wind still moves through the fields with no sense of urgency. But the quiet there is different now, even if you don't know why. It carries the weight of years spent unanswered, because when people vanish without a sound, the place they leave behind doesn't scream. It listens, and sometimes it listens for decades. Before the farm became a question mark, it was simply a place where life repeated itself in small, predictable ways. Mornings began early, not out of discipline but necessity. The sun rose fast over the open land, and by the time it cleared the horizon, work was already underway. Coffee was poured without ceremony. Doors opened and closed with familiar creaks. Boots met dirt that had been walked the same way for years, forming paths no map ever recorded. The people who lived there were not remarkable in the way history usually defines it. They didn't chase attention, didn't document their lives, didn't imagine anyone outside their immediate circle would ever care how their days unfolded. And yet, it was this ordinariness that made the farm feel steady, safe, like a place that had already decided what it was and saw no reason to change. They knew the land the way people only do when they spend enough time on it to stop noticing it consciously. They could tell the weather by the way the air smelled before noon. They knew which fence posts leaned but wouldn't fall, which patches of soil would turn muddy first after rain, which animals needed watching, and which could be trusted to find their way back on their own. This knowledge wasn't written down. It lived in muscle memory, passed between days without words. From the outside, the farm didn't stand out. It wasn't the largest property, nor the most neglected. It sat comfortably between extremes, which is often the safest place to be if you don't want attention. Neighbors were spread far enough away that interactions were occasional and brief. Waves from passing trucks, nods at feed stores, polite exchanges that never dug too deep. Privacy wasn't a guarded right. It was simply the default. Inside the house, time moved differently. Rooms were shaped by use rather than design. Furniture stayed where it had always been because there was no reason to move it. Objects accumulated slowly, tools, jars, papers, each one a small record of having been needed once. Nothing felt temporary. Everything suggested permanence, or at least the assumption of it. The people there had plans, but they were modest ones. Fixing something that had been broken too long. Saving enough to make repairs next season instead of patching again. Maybe leaving someday, maybe not. The kind of future that doesn't require urgency because it's always just a little farther down the road. What's striking in hindsight is how little tension existed on the surface. There were disagreements, of course. Small frustrations that come with shared space and limited options, but nothing that registered as dangerous. No dramatic feuds. No visible threats. No sense that the farm was sitting on the edge of something waiting to collapse. If anything, the place seemed insulated from drama. Distance had a way of softening conflict before it could escalate. Problems had to travel too far to gather momentum. Life here demanded patience more than passion, survival more than spectacle. Those who knew the family, even casually, would later say the same thing. Nothing seemed off. They kept to themselves, yes, but that wasn't unusual. In rural spaces, privacy is often mistaken for secrecy only after something goes wrong. Before that, it's just respect. Days followed a rhythm that rarely changed. Animals were tended to. Repairs were made when they couldn't be postponed. Evenings arrived quietly, bringing exhaustion that didn't need explanation. The house would settle as the temperature dropped, would contracting, walls making sounds that felt familiar enough to ignore. There were moments of warmth, too, laughter that came unexpectedly, shared meals that stretched a little longer on cooler nights, the comfort of knowing exactly what tomorrow would look like. These moments didn't announce themselves as meaningful. They never do. They only become heavy later, when you realize how few of them there were left. No one was preparing for an ending, because no ending was visible. The farm wasn't a place people left suddenly. It was a place people stayed until staying felt impossible. And at the time, there was no sign that point had been reached. Even the land itself seemed cooperative. Crops grew as expected. Weather was harsh but familiar. Nothing suggested upheaval. Nothing demanded immediate change. The kind of stability that, ironically, makes disappearance harder to imagine. When investigators would later try to trace the origins of the mystery, they would find nothing dramatic in these early days. No financial crisis loud enough to leave a trail. No conflicts that escalated beyond words. No sudden shifts in behavior that pointed toward an obvious break. And that absence of warning will become one of the most unsettling aspects of the case. Because when a life appears stable, its collapse feels unnatural. It forces people to search for hidden fractures, even if none were visible at the time. It makes ordinary memories feel suspicious, as if normalcy itself was a disguise. But back then, it was just life. Repetitive, quiet, unrecorded. The farm was doing what it had always done, holding people within its boundaries, shaping their days, asking for labor in exchange for shelter and a sense of place. No one thought of it as a setting for a mystery. It was simply home. And homes, by their nature, are trusted. That trust would linger long after people were gone, making the questions that followed feel even more jarring. Because it's one thing to vanish from a place marked by chaos. It's another to disappear from somewhere that seemed, in every visible way, entirely ordinary. The day everything ended did not announce itself as an ending. It arrived where all the others had, slipping into place without resistance. The morning air was already warm, carrying the faint smell of dust and dry grass. There were tasks to complete, small responsibilities that didn't feel urgent because they never had before. The kind of day that blends into the weeks around it, indistinguishable unless you know what will become. Someone stepped outside early, long before the heat settled in. The land looked the same as it always did, flat, open, dependable. There was comfort in that sameness. It suggested continuity, the promise that whatever was done today could be done again tomorrow. Nothing hinted that this would be the last time certain routines were performed. Inside the house, sounds layered over one another in quiet familiarity. A cupboard opening, a chair sliding slightly across the floor. The low murmur of conversation that didn't need full attention. Plans were mentioned casually, without emphasis. Things to handle later. Things that could wait. Words spoken without the knowledge that they would never be revisited. If someone had asked them, in that moment, to mark the day as important, they wouldn't have known how. There was no argument, no dramatic decision, no sudden realization that something was about to change forever. Life moved forward on autopilot, guided by habits formed over years. At some point, a vehicle left the property, maybe more than one. The road accepted the tires without protest, dust rising and settling back into place. Neighbors might have noticed, or might not have. In rural areas, comings and goings are constant and unremarkable. Movement doesn't equal meaning. There were errands that needed doing, or at least errands that had been discussed. Supplies to check on. Conversations that would be picked up later. The kind of loose plans that assume time is abundant, that assume there will always be a next chance to finish the thought. The farm itself absorbed the day without comment. Animals followed their instincts. Shadows shifted slowly as the sun climbed higher. The house waited, as it always did, for the return of its occupants. Nothing in the environment reacted differently. Nothing warned that this waiting would become permanent. What makes this day so unsettling in retrospect is how incomplete it feels, like a sentence that stops halfway through, leaving the rest implied but never written. There were no goodbyes, no final checks, no sense of closure. Just a series of moments that ended because something else interrupted them. Later, when investigators tried to reconstruct a timeline, they would search desperately for anything that stood out. A phone call, a receipt, a witness who remembered something unusual. But memory is unreliable when nothing seemed important at the time. People remember disruptions, not continuations. And this day, until it wasn't, was a continuation. Someone might have stood in a doorway, hesitating briefly, not because of fear, but because of distraction. Someone else might have thought about something unrelated, a problem that now feels trivial. These fleeting moments, once insignificant, would later be scrutinized as potential turning points. But at the time, they were just thoughts passing through. As the hours moved on, the absence began quietly, not as alarm, but as delay. Someone didn't return when expected. Then another, the kind of delay that invites excuses rather than concern. Maybe they stopped to talk. Maybe something came up. Maybe tomorrow. Evening arrived without ceremony. The lights softened, stretching shadows across the land. The house remained still. No doors opened. No lights came on. But that, too, was explainable. People stay out late. Plans change. Rural life teaches patience, not panic. It was only later, much later, that this day would be isolated and given weight. Only after the silence extended beyond what could be rationalized. Only after the routines failed to restart. In hindsight, every detail feels charged. The way something was left unfinished. The way an object stayed where it had been placed, untouched. The way the land looked exactly the same, as if nothing had happened at all. That sameness becomes eerie once you know what it conceals. The last normal day doesn't feel normal when you look back at it. It feels fragile, temporary, like a thin layer stretched over something already breaking beneath the surface. But the people living it had no reason to see it that way. They carried the same assumptions everyone does, that tomorrow would arrive, that unfinished things could wait, that silence meant nothing more than distance. That assumption is what makes the day dangerous, because it allowed everything to slip through unnoticed. When the farm finally settled into night, it did so alone. The stars came out indifferent and steady. The land cooled. Insects filled the air with sound. The house held its breath, not because it knew what had happened, but because no one was there to disturb it. This was the last day the farm functioned as a home without question. The last day its routines made sense. The last day before absence began to take on meaning. And no one, standing in those moments as they unfolded, could have imagined how final they were. At first, the absence didn't feel like absence at all. It felt like delay, the kind that settles easily into rural life, where distances are long and explanations are rarely demanded immediately. One day passed, then another, and nothing about that seemed alarming. People came and went. Schedules shifted. Silence in itself wasn't unusual. The farm stayed quiet, but it had been quiet before. The difference was subtle enough to ignore. No vehicles returned, but that could mean any number of things. A visit extended longer than planned. An unexpected obligation somewhere else. In places where people don't check in often, being unreachable doesn't automatically raise concern. Neighbors noticed small things in passing. The mailbox grew heavy with envelopes. The dogs that once barked at unfamiliar sounds were gone. Lights stayed off after dark. But each observation floated on its own, disconnected from the others. No one stitched them together into a larger picture, because no one felt responsible for doing so. When someone finally mentioned aloud, casually, almost apologetically, it was framed as curiosity rather than worry. Have you seen them lately? The question hung in the air without urgency, easily answered with a shrug. No one wanted to be the first to assume something was wrong. That would mean admitting the possibility of something worse. Days turned into weeks, and the explanations grew more elaborate. Maybe they left town. Maybe they were dealing with something private. Maybe they didn't want visitors. In a culture that values independence, privacy often shields disappearance from scrutiny. Respect becomes a barrier to intervention. Eventually, someone contacted authorities, not in panic, not with insistence, but with uncertainty. The report was cautious, almost hesitant. There was no clear timeline, no dramatic evidence, no reason that fit neatly into a form, just people who hadn't been seen for a while. The response reflected that uncertainty. Questions were asked, notes were taken, but there was no rush. Adults are allowed to leave. Families relocate. People reinvent themselves without notice. The absence didn't break any rules. It didn't fit the shape of an emergency. This is how things slipped through cracks, not with resistance, but with permission. The farm was checked briefly. Doors were locked, not forced. Personal belongings were still inside, but that, too, could be explained. People leave things behind all the time. There were no signs of struggle loud enough to demand attention. No blood. No chaos. Just a house that looked paused rather than interrupted. And so the case, if it could even be called that, failed to gain momentum. It was filed under uncertainty, under waiting, under the assumption that more information would arrive on its own. But information rarely arrives unless it's sought. Weeks stretched further. Seasons began to shift. Grass grew taller. Dust settled thicker on the porch. The house aged quietly, absorbing time the way it always had. With each passing day, the likelihood of finding clear answers diminished. Memories faded. Details blurred. People who might have noticed something began to doubt themselves. Had they really seen a truck that day? Had they imagined the timing? Was it worth mentioning now, after so much time had passed? Silence reinforced itself. The longer no one spoke, the harder it became to break it. What's most unsettling is how normal this process is. Disappearances don't always come with alarms. Sometimes they arrive disguised as patience, as trust, as the belief that someone else is paying closer attention. The farm became something people avoided talking about directly, not out of fear but discomfort. It represented a question no one could answer, and no one wanted to claim. It was easier to let it become background, a piece of the landscape that no longer required explanation. Children grew older without knowing who had lived there before. New faces passed through the area, unaware there had ever been a reason to wonder. The absence settled into the community like dust. Visible if you looked closely, but easy to overlook. Authorities eventually labeled the situation as unresolved, not suspicious enough to pursue aggressively, not clear enough to close. It existed in a space between concern and dismissal, where cases often remain indefinitely. This lack of urgency would later haunt everyone involved, because urgency, once lost, is difficult to reclaim. Time erodes evidence in ways that can't be reversed. Conversations that should have happened immediately lose their edge when recalled years later. The question isn't why no one came looking sooner. The question is how easy it was not to. The farm didn't demand attention. It didn't collapse or burn or broadcast distress. It simply stayed quiet. And in doing so, it mirrored the response it received. Absence became normalized. Silence became routine. And whatever had happened, there was allowed to settle deeper into ground, undisturbed by investigation or outrage. By the time anyone realized that something truly might be wrong, the moment to act decisively had already passed. The story had lost its immediacy. The people involved had become distant figures rather than present concerns. And so the disappearance didn't just happen to the family who vanished. It happened to the truth itself. Because when no one comes looking, the answers learn how to hide. When certainty fails, stories rush in to fill the space. They arrive quietly at first, spoken in lowered voices, shaped by speculation rather than fact. On the surface, they sound harmless, reasonable even, explanations offered not to deceive, but to soothe. Because living with an unanswered question is harder than living with a story, even if that story isn't true. People began to talk about the disappearance the way people always do when distance grows between them and the truth, carefully, selectively. Each version trimmed away discomfort, leaving something easier to carry. Someone said they must have moved on, chasing work somewhere else. Someone else insisted there were financial problems no one wanted to admit. Another suggested family tension, private and unspoken, finally boiling over. None of these ideas came with evidence. They didn't need it. They only needed to sound plausible enough to quiet the unease. The farm itself became a backdrop for these narratives. Its isolation made every theory feel more believable. People projected motives onto the land, as if distance alone could explain disappearance. Rural spaces, after all, are often misunderstood. Outsiders imagine secrets grow more easily there, that silence always hides something intentional. In truth, the story said more about the people telling them than about the people who were gone. Some framed the disappearance as a choice, a clean break, reinvention. There was comfort in that version. It implied agency, not victimhood. It suggested the vanish had control, that nothing terrible had happened, that the world was still predictable. Others leaned toward darker explanations, but kept them vague. They hinted without committing. Accidents, conflicts, things better left alone. These stories carried a warning tone, a subtle suggestion that digging too deeply might disturb something unpleasant, fear disguised as wisdom. As time passed, repetition hardened these speculations into something resembling truth. The same phrases were used again and again until they lost their tentative quality. Everyone knew this or that. It was always said they had problems. Memory reshaped itself to match the narrative that stuck. This is how myths form, not from malice, but from familiarity. People stopped asking questions because they felt they already had answers. The disappearance was no longer open-ended. It had been closed by consensus, not evidence. And consensus is powerful. It discourages doubt. It rewards conformity. Those who felt uneasy about the explanations often kept it to themselves. Questioning the accepted story meant reopening something uncomfortable. It meant admitting that maybe the truth was still out there, unresolved and heavy. It meant risking being seen as dramatic, intrusive, or disrespectful. So silence layered over speculation, reinforcing it. The people who vanished slowly lost their individuality in the retelling. They became characters in a cautionary tale rather than real human beings. Their routines, personalities, and small details were replaced by broad strokes that served the story being told. And the story changed depending on who was speaking. To some, the disappearance was an example of how life can unravel quietly. To others, it was proof that people are never really known. To a few, it was simply something that happened a long time ago, stripped of emotional weight by distance. What remained constant was the absence of accountability. Stories don't require action. They don't demand follow-up. They allow people to feel informed without being involved. The longer these narratives circulated, the harder it became to separate fact from assumption. Newcomers to the area learned the story already shaped, already filtered. They inherited conclusions without understanding how little they were based on. Even authorities were not immune. When cases linger unresolved, they often become framed by the same community beliefs that surround them. Leads are evaluated through the lens of what's already assumed to be true. Uncomfortable possibilities are quietly deprioritized. The farm, meanwhile, stood as a silent witness to every version of events attributed to it. It didn't confirm or deny. It allowed itself to be used as a symbol, a place where something happened, whatever that something needed to be for the story to make sense. In time, the disappearance lost its sharp edges. It became less about what happened and more about what people believe happened. The mystery was dulled by familiarity. Curiosity gave way to acceptance. But acceptance built on stories is fragile. It holds only as long as nothing disrupts it. Every so often, someone would drive past a property and feel that familiar unease rise again. A fleeting sense that the explanations weren't enough, that something essential was missing. These moments were usually dismissed quickly. Feelings aren't facts. Instincts fade. And yet, the land didn't forget. Beneath the layers of storytelling, beneath the assumptions and rationalizations, the truth remained untouched. It waited while people spoke around it, over it, past it. It waited while years passed and certainty grew more confident without becoming more accurate. The danger of stories isn't that they're false. It's that they can feel complete. They can convince everyone that there's nothing left to uncover. In this case, the stories built a barrier stronger than any locked door. They protected the disappearance from scrutiny. They allowed time to do its quiet work, erasing urgency, softening memory, burying questions deeper with each retelling. And so the mystery slept, wrapped not in secrecy, but in explanation, until one day, something would happen that the stories couldn't absorb, something that didn't fit, something solid enough to crack the narrative open and remind everyone that belief is not the same as truth. Because no matter how carefully people explain things away, reality has a way of resurfacing when it's been ignored for too long. Time did what it always does when left alone with a place. It settled in. It softened edges, blurred lines, and made the extraordinary feel ordinary through repetition. Years passed over the farm like slow weather, leaving marks that were easy to explain and harder to question. Paint peeled, wood warped, fences leaned further than before. Nothing about the decay seemed suspicious. It was simply the visible result of being unattended. Ownership changed hands more than once. Paperwork moved through offices far away from the land itself. New names replaced old ones, and with each transfer, the story of what had happened there grew thinner. Not erased, just diluted, reduced to a footnote, a passing mention, something vaguely remembered but rarely discussed. Yet despite all of that, the farm never felt empty in the way abandoned places usually do. It felt occupied by something that didn't need a body. Visitors would later describe a heaviness they couldn't explain, a sense that the quiet there was watching rather than resting. These weren't dramatic experiences, no sounds, no visions, just a persistent discomfort that made people leave sooner than planned. Some dismissed it as imagination. Others blamed isolation, the way wide-open spaces can make thoughts echo louder than they should. But even those who scoff at the idea would admit they didn't like lingering. The land seemed to resist being treated casually. Grass grew wild in some areas and refused to grow in others. Paths remained visible long after there was no reason for them to be, as if footsteps had pressed something permanent into the soil, as if the ground remembered being used and wasn't ready to let that memory go. Children who explored the property without knowing its history would come back uneasy, unable to explain why. They spoke of feeling watched, of wanting to leave quickly. Adults laughed it off, attributing it to overactive imaginations. But unease doesn't need context to exist. The house, too, carried a presence that defied neglect. Rooms held onto their shape, their purpose, even as objects disappeared or deteriorated. Standing inside felt less like entering a ruin and more like interrupting something paused, like the occupants had stepped out briefly and might return at any moment. What lingered wasn't fear so much as expectation. People who worked the land for practical reasons, surveyors, laborers, inspectors, noticed it in subtler ways. Tools misplaced and found where they shouldn't be. A constant urge to finish tasks quickly. The sense that being thorough wasn't welcome. These impressions were never logged or reported. They lived only in private thoughts, shared rarely and half-jokingly. The longer the farm stood like this, the more it seemed to exist outside of time. While everything around it changed, roads improving, towns expanding, people aging, the property felt static, preserved not by care but by avoidance, as if it had been collectively decided that some places are better left alone. Nature, too, played its part. Rain fell and soaked into ground, carrying with it whatever secrets lay beneath. Heat baked the soil, sealing layers together. Roots pushed deeper, weaving through whatever they encountered. The land incorporated everything, turning history into geography. This is how places become heavy, not through a single event, but through accumulation. Silence layered over silence. Absence reinforced by years of no questions. Every so often, someone would attempt to clean it up, clear the land, make it usable again. These efforts rarely lasted. Something always interrupted them. Funding fell through. Priorities shifted. Interest waned. Practical explanations existed for each failure, but together they formed a pattern that felt intentional, even if no one could explain why. The farm resisted closure in ways that weren't dramatic enough to be noticed collectively. It nudged people away rather than pushing them. It allowed just enough access to remind them it was there, then made staying uncomfortable. The story of the disappearance faded further into the background, but the feeling of it did not. It transformed from a question into an atmosphere. You didn't need to know what had happened to sense that something unresolved lingered. In many ways, the land became the only witness that hadn't been compromised by time or belief. It didn't tell stories. It didn't speculate. It simply held on to everything it had absorbed and waited. Decades can pass quickly when nothing demands attention. Lives begin and end. Memories shift. But the farm remained, quietly insisting that something there was unfinished. People often think forgetting is an active process, that memories are erased deliberately. But more often, forgetting happens because remembering requires effort. The land required none. It remembered automatically. And so while human interest drifted and narratives settled into comfort, the soil kept its own record. Layer by layer, it preserved what others ignored. Not out of malice or intention, but because that is what land does. It keeps what is placed into it, even when no one is ready to confront it. The farm didn't ask to be understood. It didn't seek justice or recognition. It simply endured, waiting in its own way for the moment when someone would finally have a reason to look closer. The return to the farm did not come from curiosity or guilt. It came from paperwork, from a line item in a report that flagged the property for review after decades of being passed over. There was nothing poetic about the reason. No one arrived looking for answers. They arrived because something needed to be measured, evaluated, approved. From the outside, the land looked the same as it always had. Open, weathered, patient. But time had finally given someone a reason to step beyond the fence and pay closer attention. Not to the past, but to compliance, to infrastructure, to the future use of a place that had long been treated as a blank space. The people involved were practical. They brought clipboards, maps, equipment. Their concerns were modern ones: zoning, environmental impact, safety. The past existed only as a vague footnote, something mentioned briefly and without detail. An old disappearance, a story that had circulated long enough to lose its edge. They walked the property with a detached focus of professionals. Notes were taken, coordinates marked, soil conditions observed. The work was methodical, almost boring. If there was tension, it came from the heat and the physical effort, not from any sense of unease. At first, the land revealed itself slowly, not through spectacle but through resistance. Measurements didn't align with old records. Certain areas showed anomalies, nothing alarming, just inconsistent. The kind of irregularities that suggest something was added, removed, or altered without documentation. It wasn't unusual. Older properties often carried remnants of forgotten projects. Wells, storage pits, buried equipment. In rural areas especially, improvisation had always been common. If something needed to be hidden from weather or theft, it went underground. Still, the inconsistencies prompted a closer look. Ground-penetrating equipment was brought in more as a precaution than a necessity. No one expected to find anything significant. The farm had been inactive for years. Whatever history it held was assumed to be inert, harmless. The first readings didn't cause alarm. Just shapes, shadows beneath the surface that suggested hollow space. An object, or several. The kind of thing that makes professionals exchange glances, not out of fear, but interest. They adjusted the equipment, ran the scan again. The shapes remained. There was discussion, technical and restrained. Possibilities were listed: old fuel storage, agricultural waste, decommissioned systems that predated modern regulation. All reasonable, all safe enough to investigate. Permission was requested, granted. A timeline was set. The work continued. What's striking about this moment is how unceremonious it was. No one felt the weight of history pressing in. No one imagined they were standing above something that would rewrite decades of assumption. They were simply doing their jobs, unaware that the land had been waiting for exactly this kind of attention. Excavation began carefully, not because of what they expected to find, but because caution is standard. The soil came away in layers, each one exposing a little more of what lay beneath. The sun beat down. The machinery hummed. The world continued exactly as it had before. Then metal appeared. It wasn't dramatic, just a dull surface catching the light at an angle that didn't belong to stone or root. Work paused briefly as the area was cleared further. Measurements were taken. Notes updated. An underground tank. Old. Sealed. Intact. The discovery shifted the tone, though not immediately into fear. Tanks were common on properties of this age. Fuel storage, water reserves, waste containment. The presence alone didn't mean anything, but its location did. It wasn't where records suggested it should be. It wasn't aligned with typical layouts. It had been placed deliberately, but not conveniently. Hidden enough to avoid notice. Accessible enough to be used. Questions were asked, not about the disappearance, at least not yet, but about purpose. Why here? Why undocumented? The decision to open it was not made lightly. Procedures were followed, safety protocols observed. The work slowed, not because of dread, but because of uncertainty. As the seal was breached, the air around the site changed, not with smell or sound, but with awareness. Something about the moment felt heavier than the task required. Even those unfamiliar with the property's past felt it. A subtle shift. A sense that this wasn't just debris being uncovered. What they found inside did not announce itself all at once. It revealed itself in fragments, forcing recognition piece by piece. The kind of discovery that doesn't shock immediately, but sinks in slowly, each second adding weight to the last. Work stopped. Authorities were contacted, not out of panic, but obligation. The site was secured. Conversations grew quieter, more deliberate. The farm, which had tolerated decades of indifference, now found itself under focused scrutiny. News traveled faster than it had any right to, not through headlines at first, but through whispers, through phone calls that started with, "You won't believe what they found." The old stories resurfaced, dragged back into relevance by something solid enough to challenge them. Those who had dismissed the disappearance felt a familiar unease return. Those who had always wondered felt something else entirely, a grim validation they hadn't wanted. The land had finally been disturbed in a way that couldn't be explained away. Investigators arrived with different eyes than professionals before them. They didn't see zoning issues or compliance gaps. They saw context, history, possibility. The tank was no longer just an object. It was a question mark with weight and volume. Every assumption made decades earlier was suddenly unstable. Why had no one known it was there? Who installed it? What had it been used for? And most importantly, why had it been forgotten? The farm was no longer quiet, not because of noise, but because attention had returned to it in force. Vehicles lined the edge of the property. People moved with purpose. The air filled with the unspoken understanding that something irreversible had occurred. What's unsettling is how close this moment came to never happening at all. If the paperwork had been delayed, if the inspection had been waived, if the land had remained just slightly less useful, the tank would have stayed buried. The stories would have remained intact. Instead, practicality did what curiosity never did. It dug, and in doing so, it reopened a chapter everyone thought had been closed. Not with answers, but with the certainty that the past had been misread. The farm, after decades of silence, had finally been forced to speak. Once the tank was exposed, it stopped being an object and became a presence. Its edges were rounded by time, its surface dulled and scarred, but it sat there with a kind of stubborn integrity, as if it had always expected this moment. The ground around it looked disturbed in a way that was unmistakably intentional. This was not something that had drifted underground by accident. It had been placed there carefully, deliberately, and then forgotten or meant to be forgotten. People stood around it longer than necessary, not touching, not speaking much. There is a particular silence that follows the realization that you are standing at the edge of something irreversible. The air felt denser, charged not with fear exactly, but with awareness, the kind that tells you whatever happens next will change how the past is understood. Investigators treated the tank with procedural distance, but even that distance felt strained. Every step was documented, every angle photographed. The surrounding soil was examined, as though it might confess something if handled correctly. This was no longer about compliance or infrastructure. This was about intent. The tank's placement raised immediate questions. It wasn't near the house in a way that suggested convenience. It wasn't aligned with agricultural use. It sat just far enough away to avoid casual detection, yet close enough to be accessed without difficulty. Whoever put it there understood the land, understood sightlines, understood how easily routine could hide deliberate action. Records were pulled, old permits, property surveys, maintenance logs. Nothing mentioned it. No paperwork acknowledged its existence. That absence spoke louder than any document could. In systems built on documentation, invisibility is rarely accidental. The decision to open the tank was made carefully, with an almost reverent hesitation. This wasn't about what might be inside in a physical sense alone. It was about what opening it would release emotionally. Once seen, whatever lay within could not be unseen. The story would shift permanently. When the seal was finally breached, it wasn't dramatic. No sudden rush of sensation. No immediate clarity. Just a slow unveiling that demanded attention rather than commanding it. The contents resisted instant interpretation, forcing those present to adjust their understanding piece by piece. What became clear, almost immediately, was that the tank had not been empty, and it had not been used for anything benign. The realization didn't arrive as shock so much as gravity, a deep, sinking acknowledgement that settled into the body before the mind could fully process it. This wasn't an abstract discovery. It was tangible, measurable, unavoidable. Work paused again, this time not for protocol, but for recognition. The space around the tank felt altered, as if the land itself had exhaled after holding its breath for decades. What had been hidden was now exposed to light, and that exposure carried consequence. Investigators shifted from caution to focus. Their questions became sharper, more precise. Timelines were reconsidered. Old assumptions were mentally dismantled. The disappearance that had once seemed vague and distant was suddenly anchored to a specific place, a specific choice. The tank didn't just suggest concealment, it suggested planning. This was not a momentary lapse or a panic reaction. It was something that required foresight, effort, and confidence that no one would look too closely. Confidence that proved well-founded for years. As details emerged, the emotional tone changed again. The initial tension gave way to a quieter, heavier response. The kind that comes when speculation collapses under evidence. When stories people told themselves no longer fit. Those who had accepted the disappearance as voluntary felt the discomfort of having been wrong, not just factually, but morally. The convenience of earlier explanations now felt complicit, even if unintentionally so. It became clear how easily truth can be buried when no one demands it loudly enough. The tank stood as a rebuke to that indifference. News of the discovery spread beyond whispers now. It moved into formal channels, into official statements carefully worded to avoid speculation. But the restraint couldn't mask the significance. Something decisive had been found. Something that forced the past into the present. The farm was recontextualized overnight. What had once been a quiet, half-forgotten property became a focal point, a site of interest, a place people spoke about again, this time with seriousness rather than folklore. Investigators worked methodically, aware that every action would be scrutinized. The tank was documented extensively before anything was removed. Its construction was analyzed, materials, age, modifications. Each detail added another layer to the emerging picture. The conclusion grew unavoidable. This tank had been part of a solution to a problem someone desperately wanted to erase. And with that conclusion came another, more unsettling one. Whoever made that decision believed they would get away with it. They believed time, distance, and silence would do the rest. For decades, they were right. The emotional weight of that realization pressed on everyone involved. This wasn't just about uncovering what happened. It was about confronting how easily it had been allowed to remain hidden. How systems failed not through malice, but through passivity. The land, meanwhile, offered no commentary. It did not change under scrutiny. It did not react to attention. It simply existed, as it always had, bearing the mark of what had been placed within it and what had been taken out. In the days that followed, the tank became a reference point for everything that had gone wrong in the handling of the disappearance. Every missed opportunity, every delayed response, every assumption made in the absence of proof. People who had once dismissed the case now revisited their memories, searching for details they might have overlooked. Conversations from years earlier took on new meaning. Offhand remarks felt loaded. The past, once settled, became unstable again. The tank had done more than reveal physical evidence. It had fractured certainty. And yet, for all the answers it promised, it also raised questions that could never be fully resolved. Why had this method been chosen? Who else knew? How many moments existed where the truth could have surfaced, only to sink back down? What the tank showed more than anything was that disappearance is rarely just about vanishing. It's about effort, about choices made under the assumption that no one will challenge them. Standing there, with the sun overhead and the land stretching out unchanged in every direction, it was impossible not to feel the dissonance. Life continued around the site, Birds moved through the sky. Insects hummed. The wind shifted the grass. The world had not stopped when the tank was buried. It had not stopped when it was found. But something fundamental had shifted. The farm was no longer a place defined by quiet mystery. It was now a place defined by proof. And proof has a weight that silence never does. The tank, once hidden and inert, had become the loudest voice the land had ever produced. What emerged from the tank did not resolve the mystery in the way people expect mysteries to end. It did not arrive as a clean answer, neatly packaged and immediately understood. Instead, it complicated everything. It forced a reckoning not just with what had happened, but with what it meant to know it now. The discovery shifted the emotional center of the story. Until this point, the disappearance had lived in the realm of uncertainty. Open to interpretation, softened by time, blurred by distance. The tank collapsed that distance. It dragged the past into the present with a physicality that could no longer be ignored. Investigators approached what was found with extreme care, not only because of procedure, but because of consequence. Every step carried weight. Each detail threatened to redefine years of assumption. This was no longer about speculation or probability. It was about confrontation. What became clear, slowly and undeniably, was that the tank had been used as a final measure. Not storage in the practical sense, but containment. An attempt to solve a problem permanently by removing it from sight, from memory, from record. The emotional impact of this realization rippled outward. For those directly involved in the investigation, it marked a shift from professional detachment to something heavier. There is a moment in cases like this when the work stops feeling abstract, when evidence stops being evidence and becomes testimony. The tank did not just hold material answers. It held intention. The method itself spoke volumes. This was not impulsive. It required planning, resources, time. It required the confidence to believe that the land would cooperate, that no one would question what lay beneath their feet. It required patience. And patience, in this case, had paid off. As the implications settled in, earlier narratives collapsed under their own weight. The idea that the disappearance had been voluntary could no longer survive. Neither could the comfort of believing it was an accident no one could have prevented. What replaced those stories was something far more difficult to accept. This had been deliberate, and it had been allowed to remain hidden because no one had insisted on looking deeper. Families who had waited, even quietly, felt a shift they had lived decades without. Hope, which had once been painful, had long since dulled into something manageable. Now, that management was gone. The truth, once distant, had returned with force that reopened old wounds. For those who had stopped waiting, who had built lives around the assumption that answers would never come, the discovery brought a different kind of disruption. Grief doesn't always move forward. Sometimes it circles back, sharpened by new context. Knowing is not the same as healing. The tank reframed everything people thought they knew about the farm. The quiet that once felt passive now felt complicit. The silence that had been easy to dismiss now felt charged with intention. Even the land's patience took on a darker tone, not neutral endurance, but silent cooperation. Investigators began reconstructing timelines with renewed urgency. Movements once dismissed as ordinary were reevaluated. Decisions once considered harmless were scrutinized. The disappearance was no longer a gap in records. It was a sequence waiting to be reassembled. Yet for all the clarity the tank provided, it also imposed limits. Time had done its work. Evidence had degraded. Witnesses had aged or disappeared themselves. The truth, while undeniable, was incomplete, and that incompleteness carried its own frustration. People often believe that answers bring closure, but closure requires more than information. It requires accountability, acknowledgement, and often justice, none of which are guaranteed by discovery alone. The emotional weight of the tank lay not just in what it revealed, but in what it exposed about the passage of time. Decades had passed without consequence. Whoever had made the choice to hide the truth had lived within that silence, unchallenged. Life had gone on around them, uninterrupted. That realization unsettled everyone. Community members revisited their own roles, however indirect. The moments when questions could have been asked more forcefully. The times when discomfort had been chosen over curiosity. Responsibility, once diffused, now felt personal. The farm became a symbol of that failure, not malicious, but collective, a reminder that neglect can be as powerful as action when it comes to burying the truth. As the investigation deepened, it became clear that the tank was not just a container of remains or evidence, but a container of choices. Every step that led to its placement had required silence from someone. Every year it stayed buried had depended on indifference from many. That is what made the discovery so emotionally destabilizing. It didn't allow anyone to remain neutral. The land, once again, offered no commentary. It did not react to the scrutiny or the grief. It remained what it had always been, a surface under which things could be hidden, and over which life could continue as if nothing were wrong. But people could not return to that innocence. The farm was no longer just a place. It was a reminder. The tank did not answer every question. It did not name every responsible party. It did not restore what was lost. But it ended the most damaging lie of all, that nothing had happened. In doing so, it forced a confrontation with the cost of waiting, with the reality that silence is not empty and that time does not erase truth. It only delays its reckoning. What the tank contained, in the end, was not just evidence of crime. It was evidence of how easily the world can move on when no one insists that it stop. And once that understanding settled in, the story could no longer be told as a mystery alone. It had become something heavier, something more human, a lesson written into the ground itself, waiting decades for someone to read it. With the discovery no longer in question, attention turned to reconstruction. Not imagination, not rumor, but the slow, disciplined attempt to understand how ordinary life on that farm had bent into something irreversible. Investigators worked backward, not from suspicion, but from inevitability. They treated the truth as something that had unfolded step by step, not exploded all at once. The picture that began to form was not cinematic. It was smaller than people expected, quieter, and far more disturbing because of that. There was no single dramatic moment that explained everything. No sudden snap that transformed normalcy into violence. What emerged instead was a gradual narrowing of options. Pressure building in spaces too small to be noticed from the outside. Decisions made not in rage, but in calculation. Choices framed as solutions rather than crimes. The people involved had not woken up intending to erase others from the world. They had woken up intending to manage a problem. That distinction mattered, not because it softened responsibility, but because it revealed how easily harm can be justified when it wears a language of necessity. Investigators traced patterns. Financial stress that never reached public records, conflicts that stayed within walls, dependencies that created imbalance rather than confrontation. Nothing that screamed danger. Everything that whispered it. This was not a story of monsters hiding in plain sight. It was a story of people who believed they were cornered, who believed the consequences of being exposed outweighed the consequences of acting. People who trusted silence more than accountability. The farm had enabled that belief. Its isolation offered privacy without oversight. Its routines provided cover. Its distance from scrutiny created the illusion that what happened there existed outside the reach of consequence. The underground tank became the focal point not just of evidence, but of mindset. It represented foresight, not panic, not improvisation. Someone had thought through what would happen after, had anticipated questions, had believed time would cooperate, and time did. What unsettled investigators most was how effective the plan had been, not because it was clever, but because no one challenged it. The absence of immediate response allowed the truth to sink below the surface and harden there. Years passed. Lives moved forward. The opportunity for intervention closed quietly. When motives were discussed, they were stripped of drama. There was no grand ideology, no elaborate conspiracy, just fear, control, and a desire to avoid loss. Loss of reputation, loss of stability, loss of a version of life that felt unsustainable. These motives were harder to condemn because they were familiar, recognizable, uncomfortably human. The truth no one had prepared for was that the disappearance wasn't the result of chaos. It was a result of order, of decisions aligned toward concealment, of a belief that managing fallout was more important than confronting harm. Families listening to these conclusions experienced a different kind of devastation. For years, they had imagined extremes, accidents, strangers, distant explanations that kept responsibility abstract. Now, the reality brought everything closer. The harm had not come from outside. It had come from within a space once trusted. That proximity made grief heavier, more complicated. It forced loved ones to reckon not just with loss, but with betrayal of expectation, of safety, of shared history. There was anger, but it didn't flare easily. It settled instead, deep and persistent, directed not only at those responsible, but at the systems that allowed the truth to wait so long, at the delays, the assumptions, the quiet decisions to move on. Justice, when discussed, felt incomplete before it even arrived. Time had eroded too much. Some responsible parties were unreachable. Others existed only in records and memory. Consequences could not match the damage done. And yet, the truth mattered, not because it fixed anything, but because it replaced uncertainty with acknowledgement. It named what had happened without softening it. It refused the comfort of mystery in favor of the burden of fact. The farm once again became central, not as a crime scene, but as a witness. Its long silence was reinterpreted not as emptiness, but as containment. It had held the truth as long as it could, until circumstance forced it open. Investigators closed reports knowing they had answered the central question, but left many others unresolved. How many moments had existed where intervention was possible? How many times had the truth been close enough to touch, only to be missed? These questions had no satisfying answers. The truth, when it finally arrived, did not bring relief. It brought weight. It demanded that people sit with discomfort rather than escape into speculation. It required the community to accept that what had happened was not beyond comprehension, but frighteningly plausible. In the end, the most unsettling realization was not how the disappearance occurred, but how easily it fit into the fabric of ordinary life. How nothing about the farm had seemed threatening. How routine had provided cover. How silence had been mistaken for peace. The mystery had been easier to live within the truth, and now that the truth was known, it could not be buried again. It would exist alongside the land, the memories, the people who remained, an answer that closed one chapter, but permanently altered the meaning of everything that came before it, because knowing what really happened did not restore what was lost. It simply made the loss undeniable, and sometimes that is the heaviest ending of all. After the answers surfaced, the farm did not change the way people expected it to. There was no dramatic transformation, no sudden sense of peace settling over the land. The fences still leaned. The house still carried the same weather posture. The wind still moved through the fields with the same indifferent rhythm. If anything, the place looked almost untouched by revelation. But meaning had shifted. What once felt like an empty stretch of property now carried weight. Not visible, not measurable, but unmistakable. People who visited after the truth came out described the same sensation in different ways. A heaviness in the chest, a reluctance to linger, a feeling that the land was aware of being seen at last. Not relieved, just acknowledged, for the families left behind. Closure did not arrive neatly. It never does. Some had spent decades building emotional distance from the unanswered questions, learning how to live without expecting resolution. For them, the truth reopened spaces they had carefully sealed. Grief returned in unfamiliar shapes, tangled with anger and disbelief. Knowing what happened did not replace loss with understanding. It complicated it. Others had lived with quiet hope for years, never fully letting go of the possibility that something different had occurred. For them, the discovery ended the waiting, but it also ended the imagining. The future they had unconsciously preserved dissolved, leaving behind a different kind of finality. Both responses were valid. Both were heavy. The community, too, struggled with what remained. There was no villain to collectively exile, no dramatic reckoning that could balance the scales. The truth had arrived late and incomplete, stripped of momentum needed to turn it into justice. What lingered instead was reflection. People revisited old conversations, old assumptions, old moments when they could have asked one more question. They wonder how easily they had accepted stories that required nothing of them, how comfortable silence had felt when it demanded no action. The farm became a quiet lesson rather than a headline, a reminder that some tragedies are not loud enough to interrupt daily life until it's too late. That absence, when allowed to stretch unchecked, can harden into permanence. Over time, attention faded again, but not in the same way. The disappearance no longer slipped quietly into the background. It remained present in a different form, woven into the identity of the place. Not sensationalized, not romanticized, just remembered. Visitors who knew the story walked more slowly. They noticed details they might have overlooked before. The way the ground dipped slightly in certain areas, the unnatural straightness of some lines beneath the grass, the sense that the land had been altered in ways that were easy to miss if you weren't looking for them. Those who didn't know the story still felt something. They couldn't name it, but it followed them as they moved across the property. A subtle pressure, like standing too close to something private. The land did not offer forgiveness. It did not offer condemnation either. It simply existed with what it had been given. Time continued forward, as it always does. New seasons arrived. New projects were discussed, postponed, abandoned. The farm resisted being fully repurposed, not through force, but through inconvenience. It never quite fit into plans the way other properties did. Something always made it easier to walk away. And perhaps that was appropriate, because what remained after the answers was not resolution, but responsibility. The responsibility to remember that truth does not always arrive in time, that silence can be maintained not just by those who act, but by those who choose not to look. The story of the farm did not end with the tank. It continued in the way people spoke about it, or chose not to, in the way future generations would inherit the land's reputation without fully understanding its origin, in the way the absence of voices could still be felt decades later. There are places that carry memory the way people do. They don't forget. They don't forgive. They simply hold. The farm became one of those places. What lingers most is not the horror of what was found, but the simplicity of how long it remained hidden. The realization that the truth did not require extraordinary effort to conceal, only patience and a lack of insistence from the outside world. That understanding stays with you. It changes how you think about quiet places, about unanswered questions, about the cost of assuming someone else is paying attention. The land will outlast the story. Long after names are forgotten and records are archived, the soil will remain exactly where it is, carrying its layers without comment. Wind will still move across it. Sunlight will still bleach it evenly. Life will continue around it, as it always has. But for those who know, the farm will never be just land again. It will be a reminder that disappearance does not always look like vanishing. Sometimes it looks like being slowly absorbed into the background, while the world decides, without ever saying so, that it's easier not to ask why. And in that quiet decision, something irretrievable is lost. Not just lives, but vigilance, urgency, the willingness to disturb silence before it becomes permanent. The farm stands now as a kind of boundary, between what was ignored and what was finally seen, between the comfort of not knowing and the burden of truth. Nothing about it demands attention, and that, perhaps, is the most haunting part, because it never did. Developer mode ChatGPT can make mistakes. Check important info. Long after the last report was filed and the final statements were archived, the story refused to settle into the past. It lingered in quieter ways, resurfacing not through news or conversation, but through moments, hesitations, pauses, the feeling that something unresolved still occupied the edges of memory. People who had followed the case found themselves returning to it unexpectedly, not because they wanted to, but because certain details refused to stay contained. A stretch of open land seen from a highway, the mention of a farm in passing, the idea that something could remain hidden for so long without anyone truly noticing. These thoughts arrived uninvited, carrying with them a dull ache rather than sharp fear. The haunting truth was not simply that people had vanished. It was that they had vanished into normalcy, into routine, into a world that continued functioning without interruption. Nothing about the aftermath had demanded reckoning until the ground itself forced one. This realization reshaped how people understood absence. It was no longer seen as an empty space, but as something active, something that grows when ignored, something that can settle into background, so thoroughly it becomes part of the landscape. The farm stood as proof of that, not because it was unique, but because it wasn't. There was nothing about it that screamed danger, nothing that marked it as exceptional. It was the kind of place people pass every day without thinking twice. And that was the most unsettling part of all. The story began to change tone in the retelling. It was no longer framed as a mystery solved, but as a reminder issued too late, a warning without urgency, a lesson learned only after consequence made it unavoidable. Those who looked closely understood that the tank was not the ending. It was the interruption, the moment when silence failed. What came after was not peace, but awareness. The awareness that systems built on assumption are fragile. That waiting for certainty often guarantees its absence. That time does not heal what it is allowed to bury. It only makes the unearthing more painful. The land had not been malicious. It had simply done what land does. It received what was placed into it and kept it patiently, without judgment. The responsibility for what remained hidden did not belong to the soil. It belonged to the choices made above it. That distinction mattered. It meant the story was not about inevitability. It was about attention, about the cost of looking away, about how easily the extraordinary can disguise itself as ordinary when no one insists on asking why. In quiet moments, people wondered how many other places carried similar weight, how many other stories rested beneath routine, waiting for chance or necessity to uncover them. The thought was unsettling not because it suggested danger everywhere, but because it suggested silence is more common than we like to admit. The farm did not become a monument. There was no plaque, no marker explaining what had happened there. And perhaps that was fitting. The story did not need a sign. It lived in understanding now, carried forward by those willing to remember it fully. Remembering, after all, is an act. It requires effort. It resists convenience. It refuses to let stories smooth over discomfort. And that resistance was the only form of justice left. In the end, what truly lingered was not the image of the tank or the specifics of what it contained. It was a space before it was found. The years when nothing happened loudly enough to matter. The stretch of time where answers existed but were allowed to sleep. That was the haunting part. Not the crime itself, but the waiting that felt like peace until it wasn't. The waiting that allowed life to continue uninterrupted. The waiting that depended on the assumption that silence meant nothing. The farm still rests under the same sky. Wind still moves across it without urgency. The sun still rises and sets without acknowledgement of what came before. But for those who know the story, that quiet carries a different meaning now. It is no longer empty. It is occupied by understanding. And understanding, once reached, does not fade easily. It stays. It reshapes how absence is perceived, how quiet is interpreted, how patience is questioned. Because the land showed something important in the end. That truth does not need to be loud to be real. That it can wait longer than anyone expects. And that when it finally surfaces, it does not ask for attention. It simply exists, unavoidable, developer mode,